Hey there! The Sony ZV-E1 just got announced, so let's talk about it. Now, if you're watching this video later, I just want to let you know that I'm making this video on the day of the announcement. Now, I want to be really upfront with all of you. I don't have a ZV-E1. This is a ZV-E10, but I want to share my thoughts, and I think a lot of you out there who watch this channel are probably interested about my thoughts on the ZV-E1. And I wanted to mainly talk about how it compares with the FX3 because I've made a lot of videos about the FX3 as well as some about the A7S III. Now, I've owned either the A7S III or the FX3 basically since they came out, and I've used them a lot over the last few years, and I still do use the FX3 quite a bit. So I feel like it can offer some really good opinions about the ZV-E1 and how it compares with the FX3 and the A7S III. Now, I know a lot of you watching my channel are familiar with the FX3 and the A7S III, so we'll talk about what the ZV-E1 is, as I said, how it compares with the FX3 and the A7S III, who I think this camera's for, and some general thoughts about the recent Sony releases. So let's talk about what the ZV-E1 is. Now, I'm sure most of you watching this are probably pretty familiar with what's going on with this camera. You've probably watched a few videos that were released today. There were quite a few videos released today. So I think in my mind, the biggest thing about this camera is gonna be the price. Sony was pretty aggressive with the price, coming in at $2,200 in the US and $2,500 with the kit lens. We'll talk about the kit lens later. But I think the pricing is the biggest factor in terms of the design of the camera and also the marketing. Now, inside the camera, it has the same sensor and processor as the A7S III and the FX3, but it's going to be in a smaller ZV style body, and it comes in either black or white. So if you're not familiar with the previous ZV cameras, there's the ZV-E1, which is the 1-inch sensor, fixed lens, really small camera. And then you also have the ZV-E10, which is an APS-C camera. I own this camera and I use it quite a bit in the studio. This is an awesome camera. So it's going to be very similar in terms of the textures, design, layout, and buttons and those sorts of things. It'll be a little bit bigger than the ZV-E10, obviously, because this is an APS-C camera, whereas the ZV-E1 is full frame. So as I said, same sensor and processor as the FX3 and the A7S III. So it has that awesome full frame 12 megapixel sensor. It's going to be really video focused. It's going to be exceptional in low light. So you'll be able to shoot 10-bit 422 in 4K up to 60 frames a second and 4K 120 at some point later with a firmware update. Seems kind of weird that it doesn't come with the camera. That doesn't seem normal, but anyways, that's what it's going to do. It's going to up to 4K 60. There is no EVF. Also, there'll be less buttons and dials compared to with some of the other full frame cameras. And it's being sold and marketed as a vlogging camera, so more on that later. It will have the new AI chip and autofocus system from the A7R5, which is awesome. There's some crazy cool new autofocus features. It has no mechanical shutter. There's a micro HDMI port, which is a serious bummer. There's only one card slot, which is only SD, so no CF Express Type A and just one card slot. Luckily, it has the same battery as the other full-frame cameras like the FX3, A7S III, A7 IV. That was something that, like the Canon R8 coming out soon, does not have the full-size battery, which is, in my opinion, is a real negative. It also has the same stabilization as the FX3 and the A7S III in terms of the hardware. There's some other software stuff that improves on that. The ZV-E1 will pick up some software features from the previous ZV cameras like product showcase and background defocus, but also pick up some new stuff that will be about exposure, depth of field, stabilization, subject centering modes. And I think these are neat features that some might find cheesy or not useful, but I can see them being potentially handy for beginner creators or solo operators. Now, before I get into the comparison with the ZV-E1 and the FX3, I do want to take a moment to talk about overheating, because anytime that you have a camera with this much power in a small body, you have the potential for overheating. Now, there's been mixed results out there with overheating and not overheating, but we are in the end of March here in North America. So as this camera gets used out in the field more and in the summer heat, we'll probably start seeing some different numbers. So really curious about that. But as of right now, I think overheating is a concern with this camera. So now on to the main topic of this video. Let's talk about the ZV-E1 versus the FX3. And what do you really lose by saving $1,700 by going with the ZV-E1? I think a lot of people are gonna be curious about this because on paper, these cameras are very, very similar. They have the same sensor, processor, produce identical images, but there are some big differences between these two cameras, and let's talk about it and what you lose for saving that $1,700. The first one is the one I just mentioned, which is heat management. If you need long run times or you're shooting in warm environments, you need to go with the FX3. I think the ZV-E1 will be limited in that way. The ZV-E1 also only has one card slot, and it is only SD. Now, I personally don't care about SD versus CF Express Type A, but I really do like having two card slots in my professional cameras because when you're out doing a client job, you have a backup. So if something happens to a card, you don't have to go back and reshoot it because that can be very expensive. That may not be a big deal for you, but for a lot of professionals, we really like to have two card slots for dual recording. There's also a micro HDMI port in the ZV-E1 versus a full size in the FX3. Now, I complain about this constantly with Canon cameras, and I really do like having full-size HDMI ports. It makes a huge difference. I understand why they did it here, to save on size, weight, and cost. But that's a big difference if you're shooting video to have a full-size HDMI port. Their ergonomics and the controls are going to be way better on the FX3. This is a bigger camera with lots of buttons and dials that are really geared towards shooting video. And if you're shooting in manual or those sorts of things, you're going to be a lot happier using this camera. But then again, if you're looking for a really tiny camera, then of course the ZV-E1 will be better. But for me personally, I like to have a bigger body to have better ergonomics and controls. Now the LCD screen, from what I've seen, is the same as on the FX3. I was hoping for an update like we got in the FX30 and the A7R5, but no, same screen on the LCD. There are also some other things like in the ZV-E1, like focus breathing compensation, which I think all of us have been looking for in the FX3, but they have not updated that. I'll talk about that later on the video. Another big difference is when you buy the FX3, you get it with that XLR top handle, which now we've seen is an additional $400 if you want to get it with the FX30, but you can't buy it separately. So that may be a benefit of buying the FX3 for you, or a negative if you're never going to use it. But again, you do get that XLR handle, which I find to be really useful in a lot of situations. You also don't get Cine EI in the ZV-E1, which for most people doesn't make a difference. It's not in the A7S III either, but if you're pairing the ZV-E1 with cameras like the FX3, FX6, FX30, and you're shooting in Cine EI and all those, it's nice to have it, but not a deal breaker for most people. Also, the ZV-E1 has those cool built-in mics on the top, like on the ZV-E10, but it's got another feature where you can switch between front focusing, back focusing, or omnidirectional. So again, if you're trying to run really small, it has a really cool mic setup inside the camera. So I do want to take a moment to talk about the ZV-E1 versus the A7S III, because I think some people are probably going to be interested in this too. So this is going to be very similar to the FX3, and the biggest thing again is heat management, because the A7S III doesn't have a problem with heat management. Now, it doesn't have a fan, but I've never had it overheat, and I haven't really heard of anyone else have it overheat either, so big difference there. I think the biggest physical difference, of course, is the size of the cameras, but also the A7S III has an EVF, which is really handy in bright situations because the LCD screens are not great on these cameras, and also great for photography. And the EVF on the A7S III is really, really nice. You also get the new menu system on the ZV-E1, which is on the FX3 as well, which I actually really do like. But you also get focus breathing compensation on the ZV-E1, which never came in an A7S III update or in the FX3. You also get the newer autofocus system, which I mentioned before, and it could be a pro or a con, but the smaller ergonomics of the ZV-E1 could be beneficial for some people. For me personally, I like the larger ergonomics of the bigger bodies. They're a little bit easier to work. Micro HDMI port in the ZV-E1, one card slot in the ZV-E1, and also it's significantly cheaper. So if you're looking for a smaller, a little bit more limited camera without an EVF, then maybe the ZV-E1's a better choice for you over the A7S III, because basically they produce the same image. All right, so who's this camera for? Throughout this video, I've been comparing the ZV-E1 with the A7S III and the FX3 because they have the same sensor, processor, image quality, etc. But those cameras are a lot more expensive at $3,500 and $3,900. So I think the price is going to be a huge determining factor for who this camera's for. I think there are a lot of content creators out there that want to increase their image quality, but $3,500 or $3,900 plus a lens is a lot to go for. So by lowering the price of this camera to $2,200, I think it's accessible for a lot more people. I also think it's going to be great for content creators that don't have a lot of advanced video skills. There are a lot of great automatic modes in the ZV style cameras that give you a really great image. And now you can get it with a 10-bit image that has a lot of dynamic range. So again, really increasing that image quality for those creators. Also, some of the creators that might be interested in picking up this camera are upgrading from a phone, because a lot of content creators just start by using their phone because it does produce pretty decent image quality. So they've added a lot of touchscreen operations to the ZV-E1 and a lot of those auto modes, and you still get a really amazing sensor and an incredible image out of the ZV-E1, because frankly, the image out of the FX3 and the A7S III is just awesome. All right, so clearly I don't fit in the demographic that I think this camera is marketed towards, but why would someone like myself want this, or maybe someone like you watching this out there? First of all, this could be a good B cam for the FX3 or the A7S III because the images should match. It would be awesome on a gimbal because it's super small and super light. It could potentially be a studio camera as well because it's much cheaper and will match those other cameras, but as I've seen with some of the testing out there, you might get some limited run times for longer sessions, so maybe not great for a studio camera, but I could definitely see this be a great vlog camera or gimbal camera. So I've been talking about pricing throughout this video because I think that the price is a huge factor of this camera. But let's also talk about the marketing. Now, so this is marketed as a vlogging camera, and when they put out the trailer for it, it said, "Vlog to your full potential." So really this is geared towards vloggers, which most people consider to be handheld, holding a camera and walking around and filming themselves, but it also is for, solo creators doing all sorts of different kinds of content out there on YouTube, social media, that kind of stuff. Now, I bring this up because what's interesting to me is the kit lens that they pair with this. They pair the 28-60 f4 to 5.6 variable aperture zoom lens, which is their standard kit lens. Now, it's selling with the ZV-E1 for $2,500, so it's an extra $300. Normally, if you just bought the lens, it's $500, but it is their kit lens they throw in. Now, what I think they needed to do here was develop a wide-angle kit lens, like a 15-30 variable aperture lens, something like that, because this really brings back the other vlog cameras that they've marketed. So we have the ZV-1, which had a fixed 24-70 full frame equivalent, but once you added some stabilization and stuff, it became way too tight. That was the main criticism of that camera. You have the ZV-1F, which had a wider lens, but for all intents and purposes, people forgot about the camera pretty quickly. I don't think a lot of people bought it and didn't get great reviews. You also have the ZV-E10, which again is a great option, but doesn't have stabilization, but there are some wide angle lens options. And so when they come out with the ZV-E1, I was really hoping that they'd pair it with an inexpensive kit lens. If price is such a big factor of this and they're trying to get it cheap at $2,200, I was hoping they'd come out with a wider kit lens to pair with it, so really make it a really solid value proposition for a vlogging camera. All right, so should you buy this camera? Again, this really depends on what you're gonna need the camera for. If you need a video workhorse that will run nonstop and give you no problems, the ZV-1 is not gonna be your camera because of the heat management that's in that camera. You're probably better off getting an FX3 or an A7S III. If you're doing short record times, if you are just needing a very small and portable camera with some of those really cool auto features, this could be a great camera for you, but be realistic about what you might use the camera for. If you're gonna let it sit up on a tripod for a long period of time, you might have some issues with it. The other option for you is you could buy a used A7S III or a used FX3. Those cameras have been out for a few years. You can definitely find deals on them when you buy a used one. Will I be ordering this camera? As of right now, no. I don't have a need for this camera in my workflow, and I have an FX3, which is better for me in most situations. Lastly, I want to wrap this up with some overall thoughts about the ZV-E1 and some of the recent Sony releases. So first of all, the ZV-E1 is really fascinating to me because it has the same sensor, as I said, the A7S III and the FX3, but also the FX6, which is a $6,000 cinema camera. So the fact that Sony put the sensor out of a $6,000 cinema camera in a $2,200 very small body is crazy because of the image quality that you can get out of that camera being that size and that price. Now, I do want to take a moment to talk about some of Sony's newer releases and why sometimes they're a little bit of a letdown or disappointing. And the reason for this is Sony just loves to take parts of other cameras and create new models with other parts and then give some software updates to them. The FX30 was a great example. They took the FX3 and they put a bunch of old parts in there, gave it a little bit extra software stuff, and sold you a new camera. Now, this is really frustrating for a lot of the Sony users that own higher end cameras, which you've heard a lot of us complain about, is that they won't offer firmware updates for their older cameras. And a lot of them are more expensive. For example, the A7S III, the FX3, and the A1 are all older cameras that were way more expensive, but they won't get stuff like focus breathing compensation, some other cool software features, the new autofocus system, etc. Now, I'm not sure about the autofocus system, if that's a possibility of getting in these older cameras, because you might need that new AI chip that they put in the A7R5. But at least focus breathing compensation, some of this other stuff, they should be able to update these cameras. There's no reason to. And the other part of this is that I just wish these new releases that Sony comes out with some cheaper cameras. So the cheapest camera they've come out with recently was the FX30 at $1,800, which is a APS-C camera. I'm thinking about cameras like the Canon R8, which is coming out real soon, which is a full frame camera for $1,500, which is significantly cheaper than the ZV-E1. Now, they're very different cameras, of course, but I do want to start seeing Sony come out with more cameras under $2,000 to be competitive and really go after, a different market for people that have been waiting for those sub $2,000 cameras. All right, so that wraps up my thoughts on this new interesting release from Sony. It's always a good time to see new cameras coming out and more competition out in the market and all that sort of stuff. Let me know what you think about the camera in the comments down below, and let me know if you're going to be picking one up. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please hit subscribe if you aren't already, and we'll see you in the next one.